Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Q3 2023 Cyber Threat Update. If this is your first time joining us, our quarterly cyber threat updates are an opportunity for us to provide some quick insight into emerging and evolving threats across the cybersecurity landscape. I'm happy to be joined by my colleague Rick Mutzel, as always, who wants to dive into these topics to no end. So let me start with some quick introductions. I'm Kaylee Alessandro. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Omega Systems. And again, joined by my colleague Rick Mutzel, who is Omega's Security and Compliance Officer and is at the forefront of both our corporate and customer-facing security practices. Rick, I think we have a few new attendees joining us today. So will you tell them a little bit about yourself and your expertise and your role here at Omega?
Sure. So thank you. My name is Rick Mutzel. I've been with Omega for a little over 10 years. And as Kaylee said, I manage our security and compliance offerings. I manage our security operations center and the technology stack used at Omega as a whole. So very broad scope of looking at all the technologies, how they can be implemented, and obviously with a foresight on security and how that applies to the various compliance and regulatory environments that we get to dance around for ourselves and our customers.
Yes, so dabbling in a little bit of everything, certainly keeping yourself busy these days. So as I said, our intention today is to give a brief update on the threat landscape and some of the trends that we're seeing so that you and your businesses can leave here today a little bit more informed than you were yesterday on some of the threats out there. Typically, we keep these quarterly updates pretty brief, so we're going to try to keep it under the 30-minute mark for sure, maybe somewhere around the 20-minute mark. It's possible we will have time at the end for questions, but we do encourage you to send those questions in at any time during the presentation. You'll see a questions box on your GoToWebinar dashboard, so just type those in at any time and we'll get to as many as we are able to. As always, we are recording today's webinar so you can revisit this content or share it with others. And the recording and presentation slides, as well as other relevant materials, will be delivered to your inbox typically 24 hours post-event, so right around noon Eastern tomorrow. So we thought it would be helpful to use today's threat update and give it a little bit of context around, a pervasive threat that we're seeing across the industry for the last several months and use it as kind of a mini case study. So in this case, we're talking about the MOVEit vulnerability, which you may or may not have heard of, but has been in the news headlines certainly for several months. So I'm going to ask Rick to explain what happened with the MOVEit compromise, but to kind of hammer home how impactful this particular vulnerability has been. Rick, maybe you could start by just helping us understand how widespread it has been in the types of businesses and sectors that have been impacted thus far.
Sure. So Progress is the parent company for MOVEit. MOVEit is the particular piece of software. It's used for moving files back and forth between two endpoints, like a modern FTP server kind of service. So broad scopes, I kind of put some numbers together. They keep changing on me, so forgive me if these aren't up to date. Last time I checked, a little over 60 million victims at this point in the compromise. And then kind of the scope of where that lays out. 84% of all the victims were organizations with the United States. And out of that percentage, 31% specifically were revolving around financial services. I don't know that it's anything specifically targeted, but MOVEit is used specifically in a lot of the financial service software packages and kind of moving files back and forth between those types of services being rendered. So it's not really surprising that financial services was the highest vertical hit. Following that is healthcare, same kind of thing, moving flat files between certain applications and tools, vendors to keep items in sync, processing workflows. After that, information technology, and then government and military fall at 7.5%. So by far, financial services was the highest vertical impacted. And then out of that, the largest victim was Maximus, which is a government contractor. So they were just over 11 million PHI records revolved in the compromise. The second largest was the actual French government. Their unemployment agency had 10 million records. And then going down from there is good old USA and the Department of Healthcare, Department of Motor Vehicles actually for Louisiana rounded out third. Fourth was the Colorado Department of Healthcare and Policy, and then the Oregon Department of Transportation. So a lot of information, as you can imagine, contained within those particular companies and organizations within the government for PHI, the types of information, if you think about what all kind of information you have just on your license when you register. So a lot of demographics, a lot of personal information involved in the compromise.
I think, based just on that list alone, and we know there's obviously, a ton of other businesses and organizations that were impacted. It's clearly one of the more significant compromises that we've seen in recent years. So we'll get into, a bit of a timeline since we know this was stretched out over several months, but I think, really it all started with a 0-day vulnerability. Is that right? So, I think we throw that term around a lot. I know we see it a lot in the news. So maybe you can start by explaining what a 0-day vulnerability is for everyone.
Sure. So 0-day just boils down to, it's used to describe a length of time that a security firm, a software partner, a vendor has known about a vulnerability. So they've had 0 days since it's been known to remediate or patch or address whatever that vulnerability is. So it's used in a couple different ways. There's zero day, prefaces, vulnerability, 0-day remediation, 0-day flaw, but they all kind of refer to the fact that it's brand new and there's been no time from the developer to address this particular issue.
Got it. So I think we're looking back in terms of when this kicked off, so to speak, back in the May timeframe. We've seen, tons of headlines popping up, as you said, constantly changing in terms of who's been impacted, developments and discoveries. So maybe you can give us a little rundown of how this has all unfolded over the last few months.
Yeah, so I think it all kind of originally started back in May, towards the end, I think around the 28th. Initially, Progress was alerted from their customers about some unusual activity that they were seeing within their MOVEit environments. There's two flavors of MOVEit. You have the on-premise version and then the cloud-hosted version. So customers started seeing things on their end using their monitoring platforms, and they disclosed it. By the 31st, Progress officially disclosed there was a 0-day vulnerability within the MOVEit platform, and it impacted both the on-premise and the cloud-based versions. And it turns out they're actively exploiting a previously known SQL injection vulnerability, but it's classified as a 0-day specifically because it's targeting the MOVEit software, which hasn't been seen before. The SQL injection vulnerability has been out for years. So old news, just used in a new way. By the 2nd of June, it officially had a CVE classified to it with a rating of 9.8, which is very, very high out of 10 on the score. So that got everybody's attention. This needs to be addressed. By the 4th, Microsoft Forensics determined that this was the Clop gang that was responsible for these compromises. And on the 6th, the Clop threat actor, I'll say gang, officially posted a statement on their dark web attributing to, they have the information, they've exfiltrated the data from the environments, and they set a date of June 14th for the victims to contact them to begin negotiations of paying the ransoms. So they circumvented in this case, going directly to the agencies or the departments, and they're reaching out directly to the victims, letting them know that their information was compromised and they can start negotiating with them on paying the ransom, more or less. So then by the 7th, everybody's attention, CISA and the FBI released advisories, and we kind of go on from there. On the 9th, Progress confirmed additional vulnerabilities in the MOVEit platform. And we're seeing this more and more. So one vulnerability is discovered in a particular platform. Everybody's eyes are on it. All the threat actors are now looking specifically like this. How can I get into the act? How can I get a piece of this pie? So now everybody's looking at it. Everybody's throwing anything they can. So additional vulnerabilities are being discovered. So second round, Progress released some additional patches for that. More CVEs were released on the 11th. I believe these were a 9.1 rating. So confirmed again. By the 14th, as promised, CLOP began releasing the names of the high impact victims. So they've kind of followed through on their ransom attempts. So now names are now being made public. On the 15th, a third round of patches were released by Progress. So continuing, in an effort to remediate and fix the vulnerabilities that are discovered. And by the 16th, the actual State Department released a bounty, $10 million bounty for information relating to the CLOP gang. By the 19th, the CLOP released a second round of victims' data. Since people weren't paying, they're gonna, make good on their word to try to entice people to pay the ransom that they're going over. So now we're starting to track how bad is the actual situation. So we know there was vulnerabilities. We know kind of a general idea of who was being impacted as they're starting to release the information. So by June 23rd, there was just over 100 victims reported for the compromise. So by the 26th, they're continuing to release more information from CLOP. They're releasing information as it continues. By the 5th, 200 victims were now reported. Also, interestingly, on the 5th, a fourth round of security updates have now been released by Progress to patch the software. So we can kind of see where we're going here. It's a cat and mouse. More things are discovered. Progress is doing a good job of trying to patch and remediate since they're in the limelight. It's all over the news, and we kind of go on from there. So by the 14th, 300 victims. July 26th, there's 500 victims now reported. And at this point, we're at 24 million PII records being exposed at this point. By the 9th of August, 600 victims have now have come forward. August 22nd, there's just over 730 victims. And by the 28th, there's over 1,000. So it's continuing. We're seeing it less in the news, but the numbers are still rising. Bigger names keep coming out as they're doing their internal investigations. You don't want to be premature in saying I've been a victim or I've been compromised by this. So as the larger companies are doing their due diligence to see if they were compromised, additional things are coming out, and it's continual, unfortunately.
Yeah, quite the timeline when you look back at the series of events and how everything has unfolded. I think one of the more interesting components of this vulnerability is that it's highlighted the role that third parties can play in exposing businesses' data. So with the MOVEit application, we saw where some victims were using the software themselves, and then some were exposed as a result of their third parties using it, some other service provider. Can you kind of talk a little bit about this and how third-party risk management, how we're seeing companies impacted at the hands of others?
Yeah, so specifically with Progress and their MOVEit, it's widely used within, like we said before, in the financial services and bundled with some other applications. So out of the actual victims in the MOVEit compromise, 2/3 were just third-party vendors. They weren't specifically using the software, purchasing and using it for something. So That's a vast majority of all the victims may not even know they were using MOVEit. It's bundled with another piece of software. I'm using software X, and software X is using MOVEit as a tool to facilitate the transfers of files to a third party, to whatever the workflow process is. So it puts increasing scrutiny on having vendor management and doing proper vendor risk management procedures within your companies. So when you're working with your risk team internally, I hope you have a risk team, or you have a risk management strategy, you're incorporating any of those third-party vendors that you're doing. So any core vendor that you use, any third-party applications and tools that you're using that you're requiring critical business functions, you should be doing some due diligence and having a good vendor management policy in place, and then a strategy to maintain that policy. So it's not a once and done. Software evolves, vendors change, tooling updates occur. You want to make sure that those programs are maintained. So my recommendations for just real high level for a vendor management policy, define your SLAs within your vendor management policies. That protects you as well as tracking whatever those key metrics are. Having your compliance standards listed in your vendor management policy. So if you're a financial institution and you're looking for GLBA or FFIEC, if you're doing trading and things, SEC regulations, making sure that you have those standards in place in your vendor management policies so that those trickle down. So if you're purview to that, you want to make sure your vendors are also meeting those same compliance standards. And then evaluating that they have the proper controls in place to meet those standards. And that's, whatever your policy dictates, yearly, quarterly, semi-annually, just revisiting those on a reoccurring basis to make sure that we're still in alignment with those. I always recommend, wherever possible, get a SOC 2 report. So if you're outsourcing anything with your vendors, SOC 2 is a great report to have. It covers a very broad range of standards. It's very commonly used, and it's going to give you a bunch of information so that you can validate, or on your end, if this is a acceptable risk for this client. If they don't have a SOC 2, maybe they're not mature enough to meet your compliance standards, and you move on and you look for other vendors that are a little bit mature and can give you the assurances that they're meeting those compliance standards. And then lastly, have something in there for a termination clause of the contract. So what happens if the controls aren't met? What happens if there's a breach? Having that risk management policy and vendor management policy in place with a termination of your contract, something in there so if something happens, you can move on without paying any penalties and find a vendor that meets your regulation standards, or if there's a breach, you can kind of sever those ties, migrate to another vendor, and hopefully not have a bunch of penalties applied to you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think this obviously highlights that the days of old where, you could throw up a firewall around your environment don't work for protecting you against some of these modern day threats. So when we think about an effective vulnerability management strategy, what are some of the layers that businesses should be considering, both in terms of fortifying their internal environments and also taking those third parties into consideration?
Yeah, so number one is obviously you have to know where your data is and who has it. So being able to identify the who, what, where, when, and why, you're going to have to know first what it is. So being able to find where your data is, what parties have access to it, what vendors, potentially you're outsourcing, you're storing data offsite. Your traditional firewall, once it leaves your environment, isn't going to do much for you. So having the assertions, doing your risk management due diligence on your third-party vendors is key. Specifically, in this case, right, it's all third-party. Other technologies, most of the regulatory environments now are kind of shifting all the verbiage to risk. So instead of saying, what is your vulnerability management, they're saying, what is your risk management strategy? And that incorporates vulnerability management. You don't want to do it once. Traditionally, I get a vulnerability scan once a year, I remediate, and then I'm good for another year. vulnerabilities come out more than once a year. You need to stay up to date with these kinds of things. So having a clearly defined policy and procedure on what your vulnerability management strategy actually is, the frequency, and then what your appetite for the risk is. So if you're a bank, you're going to have a much lower tolerance to risk. So you want to make sure that you have a continual vulnerability scanning schedule, monthly, quarterly, something more than just once a year, and then something then to follow up on that. So now that I found what my vulnerabilities are, how do I remediate? In what order do I remediate them in? And how do I devote resources or dollars for funding the remediation of those vulnerabilities? And again, that goes back to how much risk am I willing to accept? Some you may not be able to remediate. If you're a manufacturing company and you've got a $5 million widget stamping machine and it's running an old version of Apache and it breaks if you upgrade it, you're probably not going to spend $5 million every month when there's a new version out there that's incompatible. So you put some mitigation controls in place, some compensating controls. And then obviously endpoints, having a good up-to-date EDR solution, having good intrusion prevention and data loss prevention policies on your firewall. And then obviously at the very end of the day, just good user awareness training, making sure the weakest link is probably going to be your employees, making sure they're aware of not to click on links, attachments, and emails, and just having good cybersecurity policies in place for training and making sure that those are updated frequently.
Great. Any other lessons learned or key takeaways from the MOVEit compromise that caught your attention or that you would pass along to businesses to be aware of?
Making sure, again, risk control and vendor risk management are usually not thought about frequently. They're definitely an afterthought, or it only comes up once a year during an audit. So make sure that you have a risk committee if you don't, even if it's just you in your company. Have reoccurring meetings, meet quarterly, review what's going on in your environment. Were there new software packages deployed? Did it even get to your risk committee? Is your vendor management policy reviewed? Have you done an up-to-date, or do you have current risk reviews of all your vendors? Those are all good things that I think don't happen enough. And I think the trend moving forward with most of the regulatory bodies is they're going to put a lot of emphasis on that, based on all of these things that we're seeing, specifically, MOVEit with third parties, just having a good oversight of your vendors. And then lastly, where is your data? Who has access to it? And being able to produce an accounting for that. So in the event there is a compromise, you can, instead of saying, well, they got everything, you have the ability to say, where is my data? What kind of data is it? And then who accessed that data? So you can try to narrow the scope if there is a breach, or any kind of remediation efforts that are needed.
All right. We're nearing the 30-minute mark, so if you do have a question for Rick on the MOVEit situation or other security-related questions, feel free to type those in. I do see one here so far. How can we be proactive to identify any direct and third-party vulnerabilities in advance of the next MOVEit situation? So I think getting a handle on like how you can monitor for those types of things before you're finding out, late in the game, our stuff has been compromised.
Yeah, so that's going to come down to vulnerability, your vulnerability management, having internal and external vulnerability scans done on a routine basis. In the modern office scenario, where you're not going to have, from a more technical standpoint, you're not scanning subnets in the office. People are working remotely, making sure that your vulnerability tools that you're using have an agent that can also capture those remote agents if they're not on network. And then doing that on a routine, frequent basis. I suggest at least monthly, and then addressing those, having somebody at a C or a board level. They don't necessarily have to be technical in nature, but they have to be able to understand that the remediation efforts may require some money or they may require some time, and being able to equate at the very high level of your organization that this is important and that these need to be funded or resourced appropriately so that we don't show up in the news or we aren't part of a much larger compromise.
Yeah, unfortunately, the financial risk is a lot higher after the fact. So we've seen that time and again. To kind of wrap things up here, I know we at Omega sent some updates out to our managed services customers late last week as we've seen some other zero-day vulnerabilities popping up recently, impacting popular applications like Adobe, some common web browsers. So clearly these third-party applications are high-value targets. They're, so widely used, and hackers are going to continue to take advantage. Maybe you can kind of leave us with some general best practices on patch management and talk about the importance of monitoring and patching these types of third-party applications that are so widely used.
Sure. So your operating system updates, so your Windows updates, etc. Typically, we patch those on a cadence. So you have a patching schedule and those kinds of things occur according to that cadence. They're generally not released, as frequent. The problem with your third-party applications like Java, Adobe, Firefox, Chrome, you name it, they don't have a defined cadence that they're releasing these at. It's, we found an issue, we're going to release. We found another issue, we're going to release. So having a more frequent patching schedule allowance for third-party applications gives you a much lower risk because you can patch those much more frequently. Typically speaking, it's not as user impactful. Patching Adobe doesn't necessarily require the whole computer to be rebooted. Just the program has to be restarted. So, we have the ability to release those kinds of, excuse me, patches, immediately. So, like you're referring to last week, there was a 0-day in Adobe Reader. We can approve Adobe Reader updates in the RMM tool and allow for an immediate release. So, as those are come online, we're patching those in a more frequent basis than we are with just the normal operating system updates on a normal cadence.
Great, good reminder about, again, third-party tools, third-party providers, and just making sure you've got kind of a 360 view of all of your exposures. So on that note, we will wrap things up here. As always, we will share the recording of this webinar with everyone tomorrow afternoon, as I mentioned, typically about 24 hours post-event. So about noontime Eastern, check your inbox for an email from me. I've included Rick's contact info here on the slide as well, and we'll include it in the email also. He's always open to receiving your questions and chatting more about security, which we appreciate. So feel free to reach out to him with any questions or concerns you might have. Lastly, I always encourage folks to follow Omega Systems on LinkedIn at Omega Systems MSP for the latest security news and insights, as well as future webinars that we'll be doing hopefully down the road. So thank you all for joining today. Thank you, Rick, as always, and we hope to see everybody again soon. Bye, guys.